going on, everyone? Welcome back to week 2 of the Traxxas TRX-4 budget build-off. This is the series where Matt from the Scale Builders Guild and myself take a base vehicle, in this case the Traxxas TRX-4 Sport unassembled version, and we upgrade it every week with $50. If we don't spend all the money, it carries over to the next week, or if we go over a little bit, maybe we can pull a little bit from the weeks in the future. But we're going to try and keep it within budget for the most part. This week, what I plan to do is I'm going to install a set of Traxxas Overdrive Gears in the front axle and going to try and knock out some of the simple free modifications you can do, such as flipping bumper mounts, raising the bumpers up, trimming the body, just to give yourself some added clearance, give this thing better approach and departure angles so that you can nose up to rocks and climb easier or come off some of those steep drops a little bit cleaner. So as my kit sits here in front of you, it's basically the exact same as you saw it in the last video, which is bone stock with the servo added, and I've got a battery in there currently, but that's it. Other than that, this is basically a bone stock truck. So we're gonna do some of these modifications. I also have my TRX-4 Sport ready to run version here. Now, this one is completely stock. So after we do some of these free modifications, we'll be able to easily compare the difference between the bumper on this one and the bumper on the kit version that we're going to end up with. It's always nice to get some of those free modifications out of the way as soon as possible to give you a good baseline, and then you kind of keep going from there. But before we get into the free modifications, I'm gonna go ahead and remove the body, tear open that front axle, and throw in these Overdrive gears. These gears are Traxxas number 8287. This is the Overdrive version with the 12-tooth pinion and the 33-tooth ring gear. If you're not familiar with what Overdrive does, it turns the front tires faster than the rear tires. Now, where that benefits you is it puts a little bit of drag on the rear tires, and it allows you then to turn a little bit sharper as you've got a little bit of drag kind of holding it back, and those front wheels will work a little bit harder to turn you. It also aids in extremely steep climbs where the front can fight for a little bit more traction and the rear doesn't always want to grab and flip you over backwards. And conversely, it also helps on descents as the front is trying to pull you down the hill and the rear is giving you a little bit of drag, so it keeps that rear end from wanting to come up over and around the front. Now, being that this is a kit version, when I assembled it, I should have greased everything properly, and if this was an RTR, it would be a good idea to open the axles up and just make sure everything was greased well from the factory. I guess we're going to see how well of a job I did out of the box now that we're reopening this, because I don't remember exactly what I did in there. Of course, removing the body is the very first step. We're going to remove the front wheel nuts with a 7mm nut driver. To try and make this as simple as possible, I'm going to remove this screw holding on the drag link and tie rod onto the passenger side knuckle. This should then allow us to pull off the knuckles independently without having to remove all of the linkage. With the linkage removed, now I'm going to remove the upper and lower kingpin screws holding that front portal onto the front axle housing. With the kingpin screws removed, you can pull out the portal box and the inner axle shaft. Repeat the same process for the other side. With the front portal knuckles removed, we can remove the drive shaft next. And then to be able to access the 4 screws around the diff cover on the back side of the housing, I'm going to remove the 2 front lower link screws at the skid plate. I'm using an 8-volt Gyro Max for my driver, and I've got a Dynamite tooltip set that I'm using as well. So with those links rotated out of the way, I can now get to the 4 screws holding that diff cover in place. So with those 4 screws completely loosened, we can push those to push the diff cover out of the housing, and the ring gear will come with it. At this time, we also need to push the pinion gear out of the housing. Next, we can open up the Traxxas Overdrive gear set. In the package, you'll find this nice machine gear set. It has lasered on it the 12:32 ring and pinion ratio, as well as the Overdrive name on the bottom, just to make sure that you don't get confused and accidentally install an underdrive in the front and an overdrive in the rear or something along those lines. The pinion also has the matching text lasered on the end. Here we have the stock sintered ring gear as well as that cast locker. We're going to separate the stock bearings off of that locker, and then we need to remove the 4 screws holding the ring gear onto that locker. With the 4 screws removed, we can separate that stock ring gear from the stock locker. We're now going to mate up the machined gear onto the stock spool. Now, from the factory, the 4 screws that hold the ring gear onto the spool have thread lock on them. But since we've already installed them, removed them, or going to reinstall them, we need to apply our own thread lock at this time. A very small amount of blue thread lock on the screw is all that's needed. Don't go overkill on your thread lock, you'll pay for it later. Now, I'm not going to tighten up this screw all the way, I'm just going to get it close. Make sure that it's a couple of turns out still, just until I get all of them in place. Now I've got all 4 of the screws in place but not tightened down yet. I'm going to kind of tighten them down in a star pattern or a cross pattern since there's only 4 of them, just to try and make sure that everything seats evenly and spins concentric. Just by the design of the gear and the stock spool, it's kind of hard to tell if everything is properly seated. So just try and make sure that you do it as evenly and as carefully as possible to try and get it best you can the very first time. Now I'm going to replace the stock bearings onto this spool. At this time we're going to insert the new pinion gear, which has the lasered text on the end, into the axle housing. Then we can take the assembled ring gear, spool, and bearing assembly and drop it into the housing. Now at this time, before we close this up, we need to re-grease those gears. I'm using some Vanquish Products grease, and I like to just grab a little bit with a hobby knife and use it to apply it to the gear teeth. With the grease applied, we can now replace the stock diff cover. I use the power driver to get the screws close, then tighten it up by hand just so that I can make sure I check the feel. The diff cover is one of those areas that's super important not to over tighten and end up stripping those screws in that plastic cover. Then replace the lower link screws. And then we need to reverse the process of removing the portal boxes from the axle. So that completes the installation of that front overdrive. It's a super simple installation and it's going to make a world of difference. That overdrive percentage is definitely going to aid in performance. But now let's jump into the free tweaks we can do to these front and rear bumper setups. The first thing we're going to do is remove these 2 set pins holding the bumper in place. Then we're going to remove the 2 screws on each side of this bumper mount so that we can pull it out. Before we dive into this any further, this is that front bumper mount that we've just been looking at. And this is the rear one. Now the rear one rises or falls much further than the front version. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to take and use the rear version in the front and increase the approach angle a lot more by using it in the upside down location. And then I'm going to use the front cross brace in the rear, again flipped up. But I prefer for having more approach if it means giving up just a little bit of departure angle. Now to install this rear cross brace in the front, we're going to have to do a little bit of trimming with the Dremel to accommodate for the arch in the front of these frame rails. So we're going to remove just a little triangle shape from this with the Dremel, and then we'll place it in the chassis. Now technically we could just put this bumper back into place and we would have already gained performance by raising that bumper up. We are going to have to do a little bit of body trimming, but not that big a deal. However, I want to go a little bit further, and what I want to do is remove a little bit of the material just in front of where these posts meet the bumper. That webbing actually interferes with this mount a little bit, and if we remove some of that, we're actually going to be able to get it a little bit further in, and we're going to be able to drill a couple of new holes and get this bumper just that much further into the chassis. Before I do that, I want to remove the faux winch from the front. I'm not a big fan of that. I just don't want it in there. So I'm going to remove the 1 screw, pull that out. So with that winch removed, I'm going to put this bumper back into the chassis and kind of just take a look and mark where I need to remove material so that I can slide this a little bit further in. So by removing the material that I've marked with the silver Sharpie here, I believe that we're going to be able to move this bumper back into the chassis about 1/8 of an inch further. With our dremeling done, let's test fit it, make sure that we can get it into the chassis a little bit further. So everything looks good. It looks like I was able to push it a little bit further back. I'm going to clean up the corners right alongside the posts with a file. I'm actually going to use the bumper brace to spot the holes and just drill it in place. I've got a super cheap drill bit set here that uses that 1/4 inch drive just for simple hand tools like this. It works great for drilling into plastic or really thin aluminum. Not something I would suggest for some high precision stuff, but for plastic like this setup, super handy. And just to show you what we did, this hole here was the inside hole that we would have used just for the most clearance we could get without doing any modifications. But instead, we pushed everything in and we were able to drill this hole up here, which is at least 1/8 of an inch, just giving us that much more clearance. That may not seem like a lot for the extra effort, but every little thing you do like that will add up. And once you get done with a vehicle, you'll have something that's just that much better so many times over than maybe somebody who didn't. And then lastly, we need to install the set pins into the bottom of the bumper brace to hold it in place. And now we can move to the rear. Here we're going to take that front cross brace and install it into the chassis in the upside down position and replace the 4 screws to hold it in place. Now, before installing the rear bumper, I'm actually going to start with the body trimming up front, just because with having the rear bumper in place and interfering with the body back there in its raised position, it may make it even harder to find the proper line to trim this front body position. So just initially trying to put the body on, I can't even get close to the body post coming through the body just because we're starting to interfere so hard with this Lexan shell. I'm gonna put the body down behind the bumper and make an initial trace with that, even though we're still gonna have to go further. I'm just gonna kind of sneak up on the final location. So using the bumper as a guide and with a Sharpie on the outside of the body, I made a line to make my initial cut. So now I'm going to take my Lexan scissors, make a cut along that Sharpied line just to see where we sit once we're done. So first cut done, place the body back in place, see how it looks. So we're getting closer now. We can see the body posts are just even with the body now. We still have, a 1/4 inch to go or so though. Looks much more promising. So now before we just insert the stock bumper in there and start trimming away at the body, there's one other thing I want to do, and that is cut off this receiver hitch. It's just in the way, it drags. I'm not interested in having it. So I'm going to remove the 2 screws on the back side of the bumper, separate the 2 halves, and then go cut that off. And there we go. So much smoother. We're going to reattach the 2 pieces of the rear bumper. And we're going to insert it into that bumper brace. For now, on the rear, I'm just going to use the furthest most inward holes that I can to install this to the chassis. In the rear, the difference that we've changed the height of this bumper is so much that we're actually starting to become an issue with this nice molded plastic piece that includes those LED light buckets. So what we're gonna do is I'm actually going to raise these rear body posts by 1 notch. At this point I had them all the way down. I'm gonna raise them up 1 notch and then we're gonna trim this just below that rear molded piece. I'm gonna set the body behind the bumper and again use it as a stencil. So we've come around and then made an angle cut down here at the back. And after throwing the body back on and installing the body clips, we can now look at our final result. The overdrive that we installed in the front is going to make a big difference, but I think even more than the overdrive is going to be the free modifications that we got done. This is a massive increase in approach and departure angles over a stock TRX-4 Sport. I've got one here. We're gonna do some close-ups showing you just how different it is. Now the front, using that rear cross brace, really raised it up. It's gonna get that bumper way out of the way. I'll try and do some rough measurements of the angle using my iPhone. We'll see exactly how it compares, but just visually a huge difference. And not to mention in the rear, just the simple modification of getting that bumper tucked in and cutting off that receiver hitch is going to make a noticeable difference when you're dragging the back of this truck around. 55 to 56 degrees for the front of a stock TRX-4 Sport. $62 degrees for the front. And 42 to 43 degrees for the rear of a stock TRX-4 Sport. 54 degrees for the rear. So after looking at some actual hard numbers, we can really see the difference that we gained with no money spent on that part of the build. But with that said, let's run through our current status of the budget. This week, the only thing that we bought was that front overdrive gear set. So we'll take the cost of that and subtract it from our 50 bucks, and it'll leave us with about 10 bucks extra to spend on next week's upgrades. For this week's question, If you have a TRX-4 Sport or a Defender, any of those, is swapping around and raising the bumpers to gain performance something that you're interested in doing, or are you going to try and go right to swapping the bumpers out for something completely different? Now, of course, combining those two things is also an option, but let me know what you plan to do with yours in the comments below. But with that, guys, thanks for watching. Make sure and go check out Matt's video over at Scale Builders Guild with his week 2 of the budget build. Hit the like button if you enjoy these videos. Subscribe if you're not already. Hit the notification bell so you see the videos as soon as they get uploaded. I appreciate all of you guys for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.